What if the most devastating decision King Charles has made about Meghan Markle didn't come with a speech, didn't come with a press release, didn't even come with a confrontation? What if it came through silence? But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because that's the part most people are missing. Everyone keeps waiting for the big moment. The dramatic announcement. The palace statement that finally says it out loud. But inside the monarchy, the most final decisions are rarely loud. They're procedural, administrative, quiet enough that by the time the outside world notices, it's already too late to change anything. And that's why this story matters right now. Not because of old grievances, not because of interviews from years ago, but because something has shifted recently, subtly, deliberately. And according to multiple confirmations emerging behind the scenes, King Charles has done something unprecedented in its finality. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, is no longer just distanced. She is no longer just separate. She has been officially, structurally, and permanently cut off from royal inheritance. Not symbolically, not emotionally, formally. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, let's slow down for a moment. Because this isn't about money in the way people think about money. This isn't about a check being ripped up or an account being frozen. In the royal system, inheritance is power. It's access. It's future relevance. It's the quiet assurance that, no matter what happens publicly, you still belong to the structure that outlives you. And that's exactly what's been removed. What makes this unsettling isn't anger. There's no rage here. No public rebuke. In fact, what's striking is how calm this appears to be. Almost clinical. King Charles didn't lash out. He didn't correct the narrative. He didn't engage. He waited. And then he moved in a way that doesn't invite negotiation. Ask yourself this. When someone stops arguing with you entirely, what does that usually mean? Because insiders describe this not as punishment, but as closure. A line quietly drawn. And once that line exists inside the monarchy, it doesn't get erased. It gets absorbed into precedent. The timing matters. It's happening during a period when the royal family is consolidating, simplifying, and preparing for longevity. Slimmer roles, clearer boundaries, less ambiguity about who is in and who is not. In that context, leaving Meghan in a gray zone wasn't just inconvenient. It was risky, and so the gray zone disappeared. What's more unsettling is how this confirmation came about. Not through drama, not through confrontation, but through absence. Through things not happening. Through doors that simply stopped opening. You may be wondering, if this is real, why hasn't anyone said it plainly? Because inside this institution, saying less is saying more. And by the time Meghan understood what that silence meant, the decision was no longer emotional. It was already embedded. Because what King Charles confirmed wasn't a punishment. It was an exit. And the way that exit began is where this story really starts. Not with a confrontation. Not with a phone call. Not with an argument that leaks to the press. It begins with something far less dramatic and far more effective. It begins with nothing happening. No invitations. No updates. No quiet reassurances that used to arrive through intermediaries. Just space. And inside the royal system, space is never accidental. Here's the part that's uncomfortable to admit. For a long time, Meghan wasn't being pushed out. She was being observed. Watched. Not in a paranoid sense, but in the way institutions watch variables. What happens if we say nothing? What happens if we don't correct the narrative? What happens if we simply let time do the work? King Charles, by temperament, is not impulsive. Anyone who has followed his decades-long wait for the throne understands this. He thinks in years, sometimes generations. So when people assume this decision came from frustration or anger, they're missing the point. Anger demands reaction. This didn't. This was patience. And patience inside a monarchy is power. What's striking is how early the shift may have started. Long before headlines caught on. Long before commentators began speculating about reconciliation. Behind closed doors, certain mechanisms simply stopped engaging. Advisors reassigned. Conversations delayed. Requests rerouted. Not denied, just unanswered. That distinction matters. Because denial creates conflict. Silence creates distance. And distance, over time, becomes policy. Ask yourself this. If every door technically still exists, but none of them open anymore, are you still inside? What makes this more unsettling is that there was no single moment Meghan could point to and say, that's when it happened. No rupture, no dramatic fallout, just a gradual realization that the old assumptions no longer applied. That access, once taken for granted, now required effort. And even then, effort didn't guarantee response. And here's the contradiction that keeps resurfacing. Publicly, there was restraint, neutral language, even moments that appeared conciliatory. But privately, the architecture was shifting. Roles were being clarified, futures simplified, and in that simplification, there was no longer a place reserved. This is where inheritance comes back into the picture, not as money, but as signal. Because within royal planning, inheritance isn't reactive. It's anticipatory. It reflects who is expected to remain relevant to the institution decades from now. And somewhere along that timeline, Meghan's name stopped appearing where it once might have. Quietly. No announcement followed. None was needed. In fact, an announcement would have defeated the purpose. Because the goal wasn't to provoke response. It was to end the conversation altogether. And when conversations end at that level, they don't restart. The most revealing detail isn't what King Charles did. It's what he didn't do. He didn't correct Meghan's public positioning. He didn't challenge narratives. He didn't engage in back and forth. He simply allowed the system to move forward without her. And by the time that absence became visible from the outside, the internal decision had already hardened into structure. Because once the monarchy stops planning around you, it's already over. But here's the part no one saw coming. The real confirmation didn't come from a document or a declaration. It came from who already knew, and who very clearly did not. And that's where this story turns. So what does cut off actually mean inside a monarchy? Because this is where most people get it wrong. It's easy to imagine inheritance as a pile of money, a ledger, a number that goes up or disappears. But inside the royal system, money is almost secondary. The real inheritance is relevance, continuity, being written into the future tense instead of the past. And once you understand that, this story becomes much colder. Royal inheritance isn't about what you receive today. It's about whether the institution is still designed to carry you forward tomorrow. It determines who is accounted for in long-term trusts, in contingency planning, in generational frameworks that stretch decades ahead. And those frameworks don't adjust emotionally. They adjust structurally. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't get removed in a dramatic sense. You simply stop being included. No one calls to explain it. No one sits you down and spells it out. Because explaining implies debate. And debate implies leverage. This process allows neither. Think about how devastating that actually is. There's no moment to protest. No single decision to appeal. Just a growing realization that the system has moved on and you're standing outside it, still speaking as if it hasn't. And that's where the contradiction becomes almost painful to watch. Meghan's public posture suggested independence, autonomy, self-direction. But behind the scenes, the monarchy was interpreting that posture very literally. Independence wasn't being challenged. It was being accepted, fully. Because institutions don't chase what chooses to leave. They reorganize around it. This is why being cut off from inheritance isn't just symbolic. It quietly affects everything downstream. Status, assumptions, even how future generations are contextualized. When someone is no longer part of the inherited structure, their role in the story changes. They're no longer a chapter that continues. They become a footnote that concludes. Ask yourself this. How do you negotiate with a system that no longer considers you part of its future? And here's where King Charles's approach becomes unmistakably clear. He didn't frame this as discipline. He framed it as alignment. A recognition that paths had diverged, and that divergence needed to be formalized. That's what makes this so final. There's no anger to walk back. No apology that fixes it. Because nothing went wrong in the traditional sense. The monarchy simply took Meghan at her word and planned accordingly. And planning is irreversible. What makes this even more unsettling is the ripple effect. Inheritance decisions don't exist in isolation. They signal to everyone else where lines now sit. Advisors, courtiers, even extended family. Once those signals are sent, behavior adjusts automatically. Access narrows. Assumptions shift. Silence deepens. And suddenly, the absence you felt emotionally becomes absence you feel structurally. But here's the part that turns this from theory into confirmation. Because at some point, this quiet exclusion stops being inferred and becomes undeniable. Not because someone announces it, but because someone who should have known didn't. And that moment is where everything locks into place. So how was it finally confirmed? Not with paperwork waved in front of anyone, not with a confrontation, and not with a moment Meghan could point to and say, this is where it crossed the line. It was confirmed through something far more revealing. Exclusion. Because there came a point when decisions were being made, real decisions, future-facing ones, and Meghan wasn't just absent from the room. She wasn't even considered someone who needed to be informed afterward. And in an institution obsessed with protocol, that omission speaks louder than any statement ever could. Here's what sources keep circling back to. When long-term arrangements began to solidify, not public ones, not ceremonial ones, but internal planning, the question of inclusion didn't come up. Not because it was overlooked, but because, by then, it no longer applied. That's when the reality settled in. Imagine realizing that something you assumed was still negotiable had already been finalized. That discussions you believed you were adjacent to had been happening without you for months, maybe longer, and that no one felt the need to explain why. This wasn't personal, and that's precisely what made it devastating. King Charles didn't need to assert authority. He didn't need to win. He simply allowed the institutional process to continue as designed, and the process no longer accounted for Meghan. That's not rejection. That's erasure. And here's the subtle but crucial distinction. Being rejected invites response. Being erased does not. At some point, Meghan's public positioning began to clash with private reality. Statements about connection, legacy, even proximity, they started to feel unanchored. Because behind the scenes, the anchoring mechanisms were gone. No representation. No placeholders. No future-facing consideration. And when that happens, even allies go quiet. Not out of malice. Out of understanding. Because once the monarchy decides someone is no longer part of the inherited structure, everyone else adjusts automatically. They don't need instruction. The signal is enough. Ask yourself this. How do you fight a decision no one ever announces? That's the elegance of it. And the cruelty, if you want to call it that. There's no villain to point at. No explosive moment to rally around. Just a slow, undeniable realization that the system you once moved within now moves around you. King Charles understood something crucial. Any public declaration would have created noise. Noise invites sympathy, debate, pushback. Silence, on the other hand, allows time to do the work. And time is the monarchy's most reliable ally. By the moment this confirmation became undeniable, it was already too late to intervene. The architecture had shifted. The future had been drafted. And Meghan's role in it had already been concluded. Which raises a question that's uncomfortable to sit with. If this was never about punishment, if it was never about revenge, if it was simply about alignment, then what does that say about how final this really is? Because once an institution stops imagining you in its future, there is no path back through argument or explanation. And that leads to the part of this story that's hardest to ignore. What this decision means going forward, not just for Meghan, but for how power now operates under King Charles. And once you see that clearly, the opening silence suddenly makes sense. There's a reason silence felt louder this time. Because when King Charles withheld any public statement, when no denial came, when no clarification followed, that wasn't indecision. That was the decision. He didn't need to announce that Meghan Markle was cut off. The monarchy had already realigned. And the truth wasn't in what was said, it was in who was missing from the future. The moment this story began wasn't marked by confrontation. It was marked by absence. Invitations that never arrived. Roles that were never mentioned. A legacy that quietly retracted its arms and kept walking forward. And for Meghan, that's the part that stings the most. Not the loss of money. Not even the public scrutiny. But the institutional indifference. Because to be cut off from royal inheritance isn't about cash or property. It's about no longer being necessary. Not even as a complication. And that's where the emotional cost becomes undeniable. This wasn't about severing ties. This was about rendering them irrelevant. There's something brutal in that. Especially when you realize no doors were slammed. They were just never opened again. And when King Charles made that choice, calmly, strategically, and without fanfare, he was doing something far more permanent than issuing punishment. He was closing the chapter. Not with a bang, but with a pause that stretched long enough to become policy. Ask yourself, If someone stops imagining a place for you in the future, how long before you stop imagining one for yourself? This is how power works now under King Charles. Quietly, surgically, with emotional distance and institutional precision. And that should unsettle all of us. Because if the monarchy can cut someone off without saying a word, who else can it erase the same way? This wasn't revenge. It wasn't retaliation. It was alignment. Final, measured, chilling in its simplicity. And for Meghan, it may be the one outcome she never expected. Not to be attacked, not to be exposed, not to be vilified, but to be forgotten. Thanks for watching. If you followed this far, tell us what you think in the comments. Do you believe this was the right move? Or was this silence the cruelest decision of all? Hit subscribe if you want more investigative breakdowns like this. We're only scratching the surface. Because behind the palace gates, silence isn't peace. It's power.